O Lord Jesus Christ, our God, we thank you for bringing us together today. We pray that you guide us with your wisdom, that we may be able to learn from each other and to hear your words, that we may be able also to proclaim your gospel. We pray this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Come on in, have a seat. So, spiritual suffering, visiting the sick, visiting Christ, the chaplain perspective. Just a quick line of the format. We do have some content, base information, but we do hope to have this as an interaction. We call it workshop because we hope to put you to work. And in a way, you and I will learn together. We'll co-create, if you will. So on the last slide, you'll find both our emails, and we're happy to forward to you, if you write us an email, the PowerPoint and all the slides and all the information. If we're going too quickly or if we're missing, it's not all about the information. We also hope to have a dialogue.
And I think for today, we want to talk, kind of our overview is we want to talk about chaplaincy and specifically Orthodox chaplaincy. Thankfully, I think, especially in this conference, we've had a lot of chaplains here, and it's a growing field and it's very exciting. And so I think part of it is just to talk about what is chaplaincy in the modern healthcare context a bit, and particularly from an Orthodox perspective. We're also going to address some models of spiritual assessment that we use in the hospitals, and then we're also going to talk about a particularly Orthodox Christian perspective, visiting the sick and visiting Christ from a sort of a theological perspective.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask some questions, and because we are recording, I might repeat maybe what you say back or make a summary of it in a way that the people from the future, welcome people from the future that will listen to this podcast, will pick up on your answer. So let's start specifically. I have 3 icons, and the question is, what do these icons have in common?
Anyone?
Christ is in all of them. Christ is in all 3 icons. The theme, or the underlying theme of our presentation is the physician, the sufferer, and the priest chaplain is the same person. The physician, the sufferer, or the patient, and the one visiting, or the priest, or the archpriest, is one and the same, and that's Christ. In all 3 icons, we represent him as the 3. Actually, in the Divine Liturgy, one of the prayers that the priest reads during the cherubic hymn, we call Christ the one who is offered, the one who offers, and the one who receives. So on the same line, this is a small plug also for our podcast. We have, Sarah and I will have a new podcast as of last month. It's called The Wounded Healer. And visiting Christ, visiting the sick, visiting ourselves. You can find it on Ancient Faith Radio. This is the paragraph that is the theme of the podcast. I was sick and you visited me. When we visit and care for others, our Lord Jesus Christ is present simultaneously as the one suffering, the one visiting, and the one healing. We are humbled to be in his presence, and we are also called to visit our own wounds. Through his cross, he alone has the power to heal us and transform our powerless wounds into powerful ministry tools. That's the very basic theme of this podcast. Christ is the same. Christ is simultaneously present.
So I'll talk a little bit about Orthodox Christian chaplains. So, oxymoron. No. So I have been a chaplain for 14 years. I was endorsed by the OCA as a chaplain in 2003. And I'm a board-certified chaplain with the Association of Professional Chaplains. There are many chaplains here. We had a big meeting of 12 or 13 chaplains yesterday who have all done CPE, who are all from different Orthodox jurisdictions. It's a small field, but it's growing. And I remember years ago, when I started my CPE residency, there was not even any endorsement process. An endorsement, in terms of professional chaplaincy, is basically a blessing to do the ministry. It means you have the training, the theological education, the clinical pastoral education, and you're in good standing with your faith community. So it's a blessing to do the ministry, an endorsement. It can be an ordained ministry with Father Adrian. We also have deacons who are board-certified Orthodox chaplains, and then people like myself, lay women and lay men who are also in chaplaincy. So it's in terms of professional chaplaincy, there are many people come from many different backgrounds. So you're endorsed by your own faith tradition, but you provide ministry to people of all faiths. Oftentimes, chaplaincy is set up in terms of service line. For example, at MGH, where I recently started a position there, it's by like oncology or cardiology or pediatrics. So that's kind of my parish, is everyone on the pediatrics floor. I've worked in hospice too. We have some hospice chaplains here too. So like Sarah right here is a hospice chaplain. So in Beverly, there's 40 patients on service. So she's the chaplain for all those patients. So she's kind of the person that provides that care and connects patients with specific denominational care if they need it. Okay, so that's kind of the model that we're working with. I think we'll talk more about the challenges and blessings maybe towards the end. Did you want to say more about that?
It's just a quick introduction because our podcast is called Spiritual Suffering, a Chaplain's Perspective. Mm-hmm. So just briefly, who are the chaplains? And now we're coming back to the spiritual suffering of who Christ is in the midst of spiritual suffering. So we're going to start with a short video, and I want you to pay attention to who's who, if you will. Remember that Christ is the one visiting, the one suffering, the one healing, all at the same time. Who's who in this video, if you will? It is a very powerful presentation, and I can hear you naming feelings I can identify for myself, sadness, even though I've seen it, I think, 10 times by now. It's hard for me to hold back my tears as I watch it. Good. Anyone else? Thoughts, feelings? Yeah.
It brings up for me as a chaplain just remembering that, like, and just in life, that everybody in every moment they bring to whatever they go to, whatever work they're doing, whatever conversation they're having, just their own inner world, and that most of the time we only know a tiny sliver of what's going on with someone, whether it's in our professional life or even our personal life.
Yes, wonderful. The idea of, if you remember, I said who's who, and we're blessed that we already had 2 days of presentations that suggest this idea we're all together. We're all together in it. There's no difference between me walking in and saying, oh, I'm the caregiver, and the one, if you saw somebody's going up the stairs and down the stairs, who's the one suffering? Everybody. You and I are all in the presence of Christ, and with that you and I are all suffering. And Sarah, I think you included a quote here. Be kind to everyone you meet, for everyone is engaged in a mortal battle. Everyone is fighting a spiritual struggle and is experiencing spiritual suffering to some level. Back to your idea, in many ways that's maybe what makes us human and connected, and to have empathy for each other is the fact that we can be together in it, not better than others.
Well, one of the themes here was, I mean, there were, everybody was part of this. The maintenance guy, the doctor,
Yes.
the resident,
Yeah.
the patient, the daughter, even the dog.
Yeah,
It was like this is this huge community, and we're all part of it.
everybody's part of it. Everybody. Father Mark?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't get the title of that YouTube video. What is the actual title so we can search it?
It's called Empathy, I believe. If you Google Cleveland Clinic Empathy,
Thank you.
yeah. It's not ours, obviously, so it's on YouTube. Anna.
So I watched this video several times, and today I tried to find Christ in this video, and I thought that the Christ was the author of the video, that he knew each story, and I felt such a powerful presence of him in the midst of everybody, and he knew each story, and he knew everybody's feelings. So Christ was there.
Wonderful.
And that was very powerful revelation. And I felt also I thought about my role at the hospital, and I'm so amazed with just humility a little bit, saying that when I walk, I know people's stories. I know the children's names, and I know the struggles, and I know who is getting married and who is getting divorced. And so that way I can identify with Christ and his role at the hospital.
Yes. Father Deacon, Stephen was talking about the untold story, and what I hear you saying, and it's very true that beyond you and me interacted to some degree, in the end it's all about Christ, knowing each one of us. I think even the verses from the Psalms, I knew you, before when you were formed in your mother's womb, and Christ visiting in the Psalms, it goes almost like the kidneys, as if the thoughts are formed in the kidneys. So he knows the deepest of our story. Sayings of the Desert Fathers. I want to go back to the presentation and engage a little of the content of how we talk theoretically about spiritual suffering. So a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish. We will follow this idea that Christ is the same. The one who suffers is the one with capital O, which is Christ, but is also the one, small o, which is the patient. So we'll talk about spiritual suffering and how do we use, as a chaplain, the spiritual assessment tools. Spiritual screening tools, spiritual assessment, generalist and specialist. Then the one, capital O and small o, who heals, Christ and you that are in healing roles. Spiritual healing, we'll talk about the wounded healer, Christ kenosis, and spiritual power and healing by being in powerlessness. And finally, the one, capital O and small o, who visits, in this case, the chaplain. Priest also, Christ as the priest and the chaplains. We'll talk about some of the interventions and the outcomes. Who are the chaplains? We'll revisit who are the Orthodox chaplains. We'll give a list of some of the pastoral interventions, allowing Christ to work through us. And we'll talk about countertransference, which is very important as we talk about being in this chaplain role.
Okay, so Adrian likes it too. I like to just look at the whole side. Excuse me. So first, I just want to preface all of this stuff about spiritual assessment with, as we have talked about, we're not really going to go into sort of defining suffering because our speakers have so wonderfully described it over the course of this conference. So carry all of that into this presentation. When anyone goes to visit someone who is sick, who is suffering in prison, anyone who needs help, we are not there to preach. We are not there to fix things. We are not there with an agenda and trying to come in and talk at someone and convince them and cheer them up and then carry on our merry way. So in a sense, the most important thing when caring for folks is to hold the space, to be open, to listen, and to simply be present on a heart level. Okay, so I want to make sure when I talk about spiritual assessments, this is kind of something that a professional chaplain who has gone through lots of CPE training and has experience, this is something that a chaplain would do. But we can all, no matter what caregiving role we're in, we can all be aware of spiritual needs, and we can always be listening. We have physicians here, psychologists, social workers, and we all work together. Chaplains at their best function as a member of a team. We do not wander around and preach to people on our own. We work to collaborate with physicians. In hospice, for example, the core team is the chaplain, social worker, and nurse. That's the interdisciplinary team. And so everyone provides care for that patient, and the chaplain assesses for pain, and the nurse assesses for spiritual distress, and the social worker is looking at grief and pain too. So you're all communicating with each other to address what the patient defines as their need. So there's a few kind of terms that we want to talk about sort of what the chaplaincy world is thinking about in terms of spiritual assessment. So there's this idea of a spiritual screen versus a spiritual history and a spiritual assessment. So I have some delightful graphs that talk about this biopsychosocial spiritual model of care. Yesterday in the talk about the untold story, we also heard about this. So this is really just to show the interrelationships of spiritual history, psychosocial history, and the importance of really understanding where a patient's coming from, providing spiritual interventions, which would be, for example, grief counseling, using scripture, prayer, talking about end-of-life decision-making, talking about family relationships, talking about understanding of death, or any number of those types of spiritual discussions, modified spiritual state, and it's really about quality of life. Do you want to say any more about this? This is your... Okay. Mm-hmm. This is also sort of just talks about chaplaincy as being interdisciplinary, so I won't spend too much time on this. Did you want to add anything about that? Okay. Okay. So a spiritual screen, George Fischette is a wonderful chaplain researcher who is kind of at the forefront of chaplaincy research, so he's awesome. Everyone should know about him and read his work. So spiritual screen is a quick determination of whether a person is experiencing a serious spiritual religious crisis and needs a referral. Okay, so good models employ just a few simple questions, and these are questions that any team member, anyone can ask, not just a chaplain. This is actually really interesting. So George Fischette proposed this religious struggle screening protocol, and actually a lot of hospitals use this at admission. The nurse asks these questions. So the first question is religion or spirituality important to you as you cope with your illness? Yes or no? It's like a choose your own adventure. Okay, so yes. It's like, remember those books? Yes. Okay, so religion is important to me. Yes. How much strength or comfort do you get from your religion or spirituality? All that I need, somewhat less than I need, or none at all. And so all that I need, would you like a visit from a chaplain? Yes. Great. Or, for example, how much strength do you get from your religion right now? None at all. Oh, okay, this person needs a visit from a chaplain and needs an in-depth spiritual assessment. And that person would be kind of prioritized. Or, this is an interesting one, is spirituality important to you? No. Has there ever been a time when religion or spirituality was important to you? Yes. Bing, call the chaplain, spiritual assessment. Think about someone who was raised with their faith, they encounter a new diagnosis, and they're done with their faith, they're done with their religious community. But someone can say, this used to be important to you. Like, this used to be your source of strength and your source of comfort. How can we provide this to you now? Did you want to say something about that?
I wanted to say the spiritual screening is done very quickly in a few questions, and it's usually part of the admission process.
Mm-hmm.
So the very basic questions when somebody is admitted, date of birth, any of that is, do you have any religion? And if so, do you have a local community? And if nothing else, usually your local hospital would ask these questions. And if nothing else, that also is of great help to us as chaplains in determining who's who in terms of the religion. Sometimes we are able to print lists. For instance, if they're Catholic, we have a list so that they can go. If they're Orthodox, we also have a list and we know where they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's very simple. It's done in admission. And again, people come in the hospital. Sometimes they cannot speak, or they avoid the question, or in many ways. What I don't like about this, and what we recommend, at least in our hospitals, we do not ask, we do not ask the admission or the nurse to say, would you like
a visit from a chaplain?
That question
No
we
one
don't
says yes.
use.
I would say no,
Yeah,
probably.
because as chaplains we also do rounds. So to say, hi, my name is Chaplain Ingra, just stop by to see how you're doing today. And if somebody already said, well, I said I don't want a chaplain, but I don't know that, it's kind of like a deal breaker. So I prefer telling the nurses or admission, if you assess that somebody's spirituality is important to them, you can already make a referral on the computer or call me without asking them,
Yeah,
do you
for
want
sure.
it or you don't want it. It's fine.
Yeah, and I think just to note one thing that's important, people are like, oh, this patient's really religious, they want to see the chaplain. But just as much, maybe they already have a priest in a community and they're all set. Maybe someone who's not religious but has a spiritual history or they have spiritual needs too, just as much as anyone else. So religiosity is not necessarily the thing that we look for. We look for anyone who has questions about meaning and comfort. So I think that's so basically a spiritual history. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically there are different models for spiritual histories, but they talk about specific ways in which their religious or spirituality impact their care. Decision making, like end of life decision making, for example. How will your spiritual tradition impact your decision making? Mm-hmm. And there's these, like, here's a. Okay, do you want to talk about this one?
There's a few guidelines. Again, we'll distribute. A clinician should always respect. This is not about imposing one's faith on another, but just assessing what it means to them. It's always about the impact. The clinician does not conduct a spiritual history to fix anything, and it's just a matter of informing where they are. When somebody says, I'm here because God is punishing me and He's giving me cancer because I've done something wrong, this is not about the doctor saying, why do you think that? You're just assessing, it sounds like in your faith, this is how it's important to you right now, or this is the impact on where you are right now, or how your faith combines. And then they call the chaplain for, So a few guidelines. And then we have a few acronyms, which are easy to remember. Again, we offer it to nurses, social workers, and doctors. One of it is FICA. It's one of the most common in the chaplaincy world.
Some physicians probably, did you learn this as part of your training? Sasha's nodding. No, he's saying no. Yeah. Do you have, so F is for, do you have a faith, spiritual belief? Easy. Do you have spiritual beliefs that help you cope? What is meaningful as you process a new diagnosis or ending an end-of-life situation? Is your faith helpful to you, or is it something that makes things worse because you think you are guilty for some sins and God is punishing you, like we've talked about? But again, it impacts the way that you process your medical situation.
The I is exactly what you just mentioned, the influence. These beliefs, and how do they influence what you're going through right now and how you care for yourself? Are you part of a spiritual or religious community? C, so FIC. And then A, how do I need to address as a healthcare provider these issues for you? Now, again, we hope and we actually teach that this tool is for everybody. Nurses, social workers, doctors. There's actually a study, a recent research that says that patients have a higher satisfaction when they check after a doctor visit, whether it's in outpatient, in a doctor's office, or at the hospital, when the physician, for instance, takes time to address very basic spiritual questions. I'm not asking anybody to go into the depth of theodicy or anything. But questions such as, are you connected with any faith tradition? Because I was just wondering, how is that maybe helping you or not in what you're going through? That's very, very easy, and in many ways, the research shows that the patients feel more connected with the physician when, and again, nurses and social worker can use this tool for us.
Patient satisfaction, right? That's what we talk about, And so a spiritual assessment is something that a chaplain would do with a patient. So it's a more extensive process of active listening to a patient's story as it unfolds in a relationship with a professional chaplain. Summarize the needs and resources that emerge in that process. So it sounds very clinical because chaplains are trying to, be within this clinical model. It includes a spiritual care plan with expected outcomes which need to be communicated to the team. So, we're trying to use the language, I think, of the clinical model, and that's okay because chaplaincy does provide, just like social work, just like nursing, it can provide interventions that positively affect a patient outcome.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you write that in the chart? Do you write your spiritual
Yes.
assessment in the chart?
It depends on the hospital, but like for example, with hospice, the Medicare regulations are that a patient needs to have a spiritual assessment within 5 days in order for the hospice to be reimbursed. Okay, so Sarah goes in and offers a spiritual assessment to patient and family. And thankfully, in this hospice where I also worked, it's kind of like you'll be hearing from our team. So the chaplain comes by, the social worker comes by, the nurse comes, and then you do a spiritual assessment, which I'll talk a little bit more, and you document it in the regular medical record.
It's an excellent question in terms of both on our parts as chaplains and on the other caregiver of how close the interdisciplinary team work together. The best model maybe is the palliative care team. Actually, most of the chaplaincy, working as having a plan of care and spiritual assessment is in the palliative care team. So the chaplain that works in palliative care, they meet every single day at our hospital and they talk the cases, and then each one, they know where the notes are. As opposed to on other units, for instance, on another unit in the hospital, sometimes I say, well, I charted, and then I say, oh, you also chart? Because they think that, I may be clergy and I'm just there to bring communion and I'm done.
Right.
And when they see me, that actually, I take time to chart, not in my own office, but on the unit, so they see me when I'm on the unit next to the nurse, and they say, oh, you're also in the chart. And I say, yes, this is where you find my note. And this is what I put in my note as part of the spiritual assessment. So, yeah.
I mean, it's really amazing to work as a chaplain as part of an interdisciplinary team where you feel like you can really contribute. I mean, I was a palliative care chaplain at NYU Medical Center, and being part of that team and rounding on the patients and, and having the nurse come up to me and say, Mrs. So-and-so is trying to decide about palliative care and or maybe going on hospice. And so there's this issue for her about giving up. Is she giving up? Is she playing God? Is she fighting the cancer, or is she pursuing aggressive treatment? What does that all mean? And it's a real spiritual struggle. And she says, can you go talk to her and kind of see where she is in that process? And so and then you can, follow up and say, this is my assessment. And then the social worker follows up and then can talk about grief or any other number of things. So it really helps the patient. I mean, that's at the end of the day, I think that's the thing that's most persuasive, is a patient that feels cared for with medically, spiritually, and emotionally is a patient that finds comfort in a bigger way. Here is kind of a assessment model that we like, outcome-oriented chaplaincy. Art Lucas has this book called The Discipline for Pastoral Caregiving, and a lot of chaplains use this as an assessment model. It's not perfect, and some of the language is a little odd, but one thing, so you go in, you meet the patient, and you're looking to see what are their needs, what are their hopes, and what are their resources. Needs, hopes, and resources. So I need to not be in pain. I need to, XYZ. I hope to see my daughter get married in a month. I hope that I can be home, and I hope that I can, address. I had a patient, I sat down with him, I visited him for a year, every Friday for a year. Mm-hmm. Amazing. And he said, I want to deal with my fear of death. I'm afraid of death. Like, I don't know what to do, and I want you to help me, and let's sort it out. He was a really interesting guy. He was raised Episcopalian, but he was also really into Kriya yoga, and he'd studied a lot of Hinduism and stuff, so he was really drawing from all these different interesting traditions, but he really wanted to sit down and go through scripture and read and pray, and we sang together. He had all these dreams he wanted to talk about. So it was really he was so engaged, but he really wanted to, he was true, for all of his spiritual richness, he was deeply afraid of death. like
Mhm.
truly, and not just dying, but what comes after. And so that was, so, you know, his needs, his hopes, and his resources were this rich spiritual tradition he had. So then you would generate like a patient profile and the desired contributing outcomes. Basically, the desired outcomes would be patient has has reduced anxiety about death and has an increased sense of hope, something like that.
If you're familiar, there was a documentary some years ago which was called "Consider the Conversation." I don't know if you saw it. It has to do with death and dying. So at some point, I think a social worker in the documentary speaks about, when I go in, I don't go in no matter what the progress of the illness is. It's not about taking away their hope. There's always some kind of hope, but it's reframed. So this is also when we talk about outcomes, where somebody might look from the outside and say, well, they're in denial. We say they're working in reframing, such as, well, the doctor saw something on the X-ray or some kind of a mass. I hope it's not, right? Then they turn out it's not benign. It's actually cancer. I hope it's not going to grow. Now it grows. Well, I hope that the treatment, chemo and so, that doesn't work. I hope I can make it at least, let's say, next year, something is happening in my family. There's always some kind of hope. Even when they say, I'm sorry, you only have, for instance, hospice, might say 6 months, it might go into the hope of, I hope for, the future and for life eternal. There's always some kind of hope that reframes. It's not taking away, but understanding. So that's how we work with the outcomes. But the patient right now seems to be at a place where they're feeling this, their needs are, and they hope in the future. This is where they are. We accept it, and then we have a plan of how do we address that.
I hope my daughter can know how much I love her. I worked with a young woman who had cervical cancer that had metastasized, which was unusual, and she had young children, and she recorded these videos for her kids. I mean, it was it was sad. That was one where I was just like going in my car and crying. But she was like writing down her favorite recipes. She was recording herself reading children's books, so I would like come and we would record her daughter's favorite books and stuff, and because she wanted her daughter to know her, and to have that wisdom. She wrote her letters, for each birthday. But that's that's so important. It's so beautiful. So the idea that for her, she had really come to terms with the fact that she was dying, but she for her to know that this was something that her daughter would have was truly, really gave her a lot of peace. It was heartbreaking, but it was very meaningful. I'm going to skip over some of these things so we can get to kind of the good stuff. But so here's some more spiritual assessment examples. Diagnosis, like abandonment, existential issues, anger at God, concerns about relationship with God, conflicted or challenging belief systems, despair, grief and loss. All these kinds of things can be related to spiritual issues and can be helped with spiritual interventions.
The National Cancer Network, National Comprehensive, I think it's called, Cancer Network actually came up with diagnosis. There is a movement within chaplaincy that tries to make a manual similar to the DSM-4 or DSM-5. We're not agreeing that we should have one, but it is a good idea to try to put it in titles at least. And some of the diagnoses that they came up with for patients with cancer: grief, concerns about death, guilt, hopelessness, conflict between religious belief and recommended treatment, any of that is, and they have a code actually in parentheses, ISD, I think, 7. Yeah, they charted as such, just like you would have the DSM code.
Yeah. So, and we've talked a little bit about suffering. I think we're going to have to move a little quickly in the interest of time, but these are, we heard from our wonderful keynote speakers about the ways suffering can be manifested. There's kind of the suffering that is a suffering of despair and anger and rejection. And there's the suffering, that kind of continuum of suffering, where suffering is connected to Christ and Christ as a person, the crucified Christ and the risen Christ. So it's a suffering that can be transfigured and transformed into a suffering that's meaningful. But we often encounter patients who are in this place where suffering really does not feel like it has any hope. This is kind of a cool quote, but it's a little, but basically just the idea that there is suffering that involves tears, but these are holy tears, and suffering that involves, sighing, but it finds comfort from God through prayer. It knows sadness, but not sadness for its own sake. It's not a burden, but a gift of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so this is kind of similar to what we already talked about. So I'm gonna turn it over to you for this part.
So I relate a lot to the writings of Carl Gustav Jung, and not all of it, but much of his theory I understand. And he speaks about coincidence as part of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, which is why I was pleasantly surprised yesterday and the day before to see that many of the people say exactly the same thing that I already had in this. Which again, I'm blessed to, I don't have to unpack any of this. Bishop Alexander and the presenters yesterday have already articulated the theology of it. And I was saying, wonderful. It's also exactly what I wanted to say. So we talk about the wounded healer, Christ kenosis. You heard the word kenosis or ending, and spiritual power and healing in being powerlessness. The concept of the wounded healer, which is also the title of our podcast, and it's our 4th episode on our podcast, can be found in several of the mythology, starting with the Greek mythology. There are a few stories in the Jewish, tradition, in Talmud. They talk about wounded healers. I mentioned Carl Jung also was, if I'm not mistaken, the very first one in the psychoanalysis that decided the analyst is not a blank wall, but the analyst also has to go through therapy and work with their own unconscious before they can sit with somebody else. So he's the first one that advised that, to the idea that we have our own wounds, and that can be a source of empathy and can also be a source of disconnection if we don't know what to do with it. There's a book by the Catholic priest Henry Nouwen, which is exactly called Wounded Healer, highly recommended. And I argue, and in that same episode we talk about, actually in the Christian tradition, I would argue that in the Orthodox tradition, Christ is the model of the wounded healer. You already heard Bishop Alexander talking about being the eternally wounded lamb, and for instance in Revelation we read about the lamb that's wounded from eternity, versus a few chapters later there's talk about the beast whose wound was healed miraculously. This is like almost like a trick. The beast was wounded and then it was healed miraculously, and then the beast, the Antichrist, was deceiving many because the beast stepped away from the wound. Versus Christ is always, in eternity, the wounded lamb, the lamb that was sacrificed. So the contrast is that Christ is always the wounded healer. Very basic theological question. How does Christ heal or destroy death? Huh?
With his death.
Yeah.
Trampling death by death.
Yeah.
By cramping down, then by death. So it's a very powerful theology. Again, we could spend hours of talking of Christ destroying death. We're singing how many thousands of times during Paschal season? Christ trampled down death by his own death. There is no trick. Christ doesn't have like a shortcut. He's not going on the cross and doing like wink, wink, I'll see you on Sunday. I'm sorry, but it's nothing like this. Christ actually died in order to destroy death. Christ actually entered death. And again, there's a lot of theology. If you met the book of Father John Baer, The Mystery of Christ, he spends a lot of time on this idea that we, just like the disciples, but we also today, we only know him as God because he died on the cross. There is no way of knowing Christ as God but through the cross and in his death. Again, you heard the idea, they didn't get it. They didn't get it until he actually died, he entered death. Father John Baer, The Mystery of Christ, again, he unpacks this. Spiritual healing, power and powerless. So healing for us takes place through, and this is both and. It's not neither or. Either or, it's both and. Direct intervention or action, when Christ, for instance, Christ took direct action in Christ's incarnation, and complete surrendering, powerlessness, and death. Again, many metaphors that you may hear about this. Martha and Mary, one that does all the work, and one that is at the feet. So you hear sometimes chaplains saying, well, I'm present there. There's not everything that the chaplain does. We also do charting, and we have spiritual interventions, right? So it's both and. And you probably in your healing, you also have the sense, I heard somebody actually saying yesterday of, I'm a physician and I work to heal directly, but also how can I take a step back and acknowledge my own powerlessness, my own out of control, just listen to somebody. It's both and.
Yeah, and I think, I think it's important, and I think that, it's important to understand this, that it's both. That you're both Martha and Mary at certain times,
Yep.
and knowing when to be those. You can't, you're not only just sitting there holding someone's hand. That's great, okay? But the hospital isn't going to pay a chaplain to sit and hold someone's hand. I mean, to be frank, we need to show that, the chaplains are participating on a professional level, providing spiritual care that impacts the patient's overall well-being. So,
Yeah.
but at the same time, a good chaplain knows when to be quiet, when to just listen, when to, there are times when, frankly, the suffering of another person is so profound that no words that you can say will really honor the depth of that. And so sometimes you need to just sit there, you need to pray with them, you need to be quiet. I remember sitting there with a patient who had tried to kill himself, and I was there the next day with him and when he woke up. And he described his pain, he described his theological background. He was raised Christian, but now he was atheist because he felt like the world was just a big messed up place. His mother said now he was going to hell because he had tried to kill himself. So that was made it even worse. And I just remember being so overwhelmed. I really didn't know what to do. And I just remember I just sat there in this wooden chair next to his bed, and I teared up, and I just sat there with him, and I just thought humbly, God, help me help this person. But he just needed someone to sit with him, to be present. And it made me think, I wrote about this, but it was no words are needed, but Christ, the Logos, the Word, is the most profound word that can ever be spoken in a pastoral visit.
Christ
is to allow that word to be present in you.
Okay, let me skip this quote.
And it's actually from Father Klapsis, who already spoke. So this one.
Finally, the one who visits Christ the chaplain, we talk about spiritual interventions. And here I make a distinction between pastoral counseling on a long term versus pastoral care for acute grief, and we have a range of spiritual care interventions. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I'm two persons into one, at least. Maybe I'm more than two. But I'm Father Adrian, the priest, and I'm completely different when I visit somebody in a hospital as the priest that I know from my parish versus Father Adrian, the chaplain. Short-term intervention, acute care, somebody just got in the hospital, they got bad news. Those are very different approaches to it. So what you might hear, I guess in therapy, I would argue that some of you use cognitive behavior therapy on a long term, right? But if you just sit with somebody on a short term, it's likely you go into the feeling, in acknowledging the feeling and maybe addressing that idea. So it's the same for. So now back to the idea of who are the chaplains. Sarah, you already spoke of board-certified chaplaincy. Unfortunately, chaplain is a term that is how should I say this?
Fraught.
Yeah, there you go. A lot of people feel called, and they take the name of chaplains and they go in, and out of a good intention, and I'm not talking only in the Protestant world, for instance, or in other faith tradition, but even in the Orthodox tradition, it's very common that they go in and they say, I'm a chaplain, I feel called to be with those who are suffering. Well, that's true. We just want to define what it takes to become a board-certified chaplain, which is the gold standard of spiritual care. You already heard stories of, unfortunately, in the place of war, in a place of hospital, somebody that doesn't have the training, just because they have a good intention, it leads to unintended outcomes, right? I mean, the chaplain burns out, the person, So the gold standard of spiritual care. One needs a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, so graduate studies. At least 4 units of CPE, which is 1,600 hours or more. After the units are done, another 2,000 hours of professional experience, ecclesiastical endorsement, and then one needs to demonstrate 29 competencies in 4 essays, 2 verbatims, and meet a national certification committee. So I put this picture here. Who said ministry was stressful? I'm 35 and I feel great. I would argue that, to become a board-certified chaplain is comparable to many of the other clinical training for physicians, for nurses, or it's really like 3 to 4 years Master of Divinity, and then all those residencies and extra hours and extra. It really takes like 5-6 years, if not more. It really takes a lot of time, which I hope, and we hope to communicate to you that the one that calls themselves board-certified chaplain are actually prepared to face these situations and to respond. Very quickly, the spiritual interventions that we use, I use the book of Howard Kleinbell, which is called Basic Types of Pastoral Care and Counseling. So the idea was that we want to offer you a range of spiritual intervention skills with the idea, again, this quote comes from Mark Twain. If your only tool is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. There is not one intervention that fits all. And that's true for spiritual care also. If everything I do is, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, it's like a sermon. If everything I do is, I'm sorry,
That must
the
be
person
hard.
might say, like, I don't need a pity party, you know, like,
Yeah.
if everything, I understand, or, you know, how are you feeling, all this is kind of like, what, is this a, police questionnaire? So the idea is how you and I can learn to have the discernment of alternating and being connected to somebody when we alternate between understanding, use of self and empathy, interpreting, supporting, probe for feelings and facts, clarify, empowering. Advice is on the list, but it's on the bottom of the list. Sometimes we say, there's a reason that God gave us 2 years and only 1 month. I would say 90% of the time use your 2 years, and 10% of the time use your mouth. And more for long term, we get into the advising. The rest is more overused and underused.
And I want to add one thing. So Holly Gaudette was a chaplain at NYU. She was there after I was there. And Holly wrote this really interesting article. She had cancer many times. Did you know Holly?
Yeah.
Okay.
She does.
And she wrote this and so she's a professional chaplain. She wrote this article about meaning fatigue. And she was saying that as a patient, so she had been a chaplain and then she was a cancer patient and had people come and a lot of times instead of, how are you doing, how's the weather, they really wanted to talk to her about like all the deep meaning of her life and her, existential questions and end of life and how and she was, she was like, look, sometimes I don't want to talk about that stuff. Sometimes I want to just like be a little bit joyful. I want to have a break. I want to have some peace. I want to sing some songs. I want to talk about joyful things. I want to hear about, so there's a time to really talk about the deep stuff, and there's a time to again, it's patient-centered. So if the patient doesn't want to go there, that's okay. And to honor that patient's journey and their experience, you don't always want to talk about every deep thing all the time, but sometimes you really do, and sometimes you need that. So being able to really identify and listen, hear the emotions behind the words, and hear what that person really needs is important. And Holly actually ended up passing away, sadly, from cancer, but I think she cared for so many people, and she gave us this gift, I think, of experiencing that as a chaplain.
Finally, last content, Countertransference. You are probably already familiar with the idea of visit yourself. We say visiting Christ, visiting the others, such as patients, and then we visit here. We visit ourselves. Self-awareness, what is happening with me, pastor, physician, social worker, therapist, before, in, and after ministering to others. And we talk a lot of this in clinical pastoral education, what's happening with me in the visit. There's a quote from Carl Jung again. An analyst can only help a patient just so as far as he or she has gone, and not a step any further. Not one step further. This also is a quote from St. Paisios. If you want to help the church, it's better to try to correct yourself rather than looking to correct others. Why? If you manage to correct yourself, one small part of the church is immediately corrected, but today, a little lower, people concern themselves with anything but themselves. Why? Judging others is easy, but working on yourself takes effort. Countertransference, working on me is much, much harder than, I'm just going to talk of, whatever the patient's needs and hopes are, as opposed to.
And that also, I think, raises the importance of supervision in doing this chaplaincy. It's really exciting that Father Adrian is a CPE supervisor and an Orthodox priest. There aren't that many CPE supervisors who are also Orthodox priests. There's very few. But so that's very great. But to do CPE, it's in a safe environment with peers, with a supervisor, where you really get to process all this countertransference and all these issues that do inevitably come up when you go into the ministry. But being able to do that in a safe environment with peers that support you is invaluable. And I would like to make a plug for anyone to take CPE. Who here has taken CPE? Raise your hand. Woo-hoo.
Would you say
Anna,
what it
raise your
stands for? Just so-
Yes,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry.
I don't even
Clinical Pastoral Education.
Okay, thank you.
but if you're around this area, you might be blessed. Mass General Hospital is one of the few that use the model of CPE or clinical pastoral for
If that's
healthcare workers.
Yeah.
So CPE is for those that more or less want to become chaplains, but they also have a model for those that are nurses or doctors, but they also want to see what CPE is. So they did this model at Mass General. I don't know if I
Yeah, right now there's a resident there who's an oncology chaplain.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sorry, an oncologist, and now she's doing chaplaincy training. But she doesn't plan to become a chaplain, but she's doing it's incredible, and she's great. She's doing great.
So our email addresses, again, if you like a copy of these slides, we'd be happy to. And then the plug that you just gave was up there. We were hoping to have a little discussion. We actually had some vignettes of spiritual suffering, but since we're almost out of time.
Maybe we'll just take questions.
Yeah. Any questions? Any
comments?
In the outcomes that you try to work towards with the patient, is life eternal one of those outcomes, and where does that fit into it?
So the question is life eternal one of the intended outcomes?
Yes.
It can be. It can be. Like I would imagine if a patient is a Christian Orthodox, and I sat down with them, some of their hopes would be whatever this illness is doing to me, I hope that it doesn't take away from my being in life eternal with God. Yeah, absolutely.
So I really appreciated your presentation. And speaking from the point of view of a physician, I see some parallels between the model that's developing in chaplain training and documentation, and even one of the models which is completely parallel to the so-called Plan, Do, Study, Act model for
right,
process
sure.
improvement. So there are benefits and risks, which you've probably dealt with as well,
Yeah.
to this process. One thing that's happened in medicine and healthcare that has been toxic to physicians has been the ever-increasing degree of documentation and production of
Yes.
evidence. And there's been a net effect of moving physician time from looking at, understanding, and caring about the patient to documenting the looking, caring, understanding of the patient. To the degree, and I'm sure this is true in most systems, that, for example, a 2-minute telephone call, which might be equivalent benefit to a patient, to the sense of the presence, just the presence of a chaplain at the bedside with no communication, takes 2 minutes on the phone and takes 10 minutes to document. And that's 10 minutes less of touching, healing, understanding. And that's the joyous part of the work. And there's increasing pressure to shrink it. Is that happening?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
You sound like you work in our department.
Yes.
You sound like all our
it's
students,
really-
which is,
Yeah.
I came here because it nurtures my heart to be at bedside.
Yeah, to be
Why
with
do
the
we also
patients.
have to do this? And whether I say it's a necessary evil, like nurses and others have to know also what you heard and things like this. It's absolutely true that every once in a while to balance those two is hard. It's
really
It's
hard.
okay.
And I think you think you're communicating things by charting, but half the time people don't read your notes anyway. So really,
95% of the
right, 95% of the time, I believe it. And so I think, the real communication has to really come between members of the team. I absolutely echo that, and I think it's really a struggle. And there are all different models for chaplaincy documentation, and some of them are terrible, and some are like, really, there was one at NYU where the box, it was relationship to transcendent restored, checkbox. Like, we wanted to make a t-shirt with that because it was just so like slogany, like relationship to transcendent, but you thought, oh, okay, well, that's good. I checked that one off. It's really more of an ongoing dialogue, I'd like to think. Yes, did you have a question?
I have 2 quick questions. First of all, Father, do you wear your collar when you're a chaplain?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Depending on the day and depending on the situation, I find that sometimes I work against more assumptions if I wear a collar, but it's not a deal breaker either. So if I do have a collar, like for instance, if I go to church immediately after, and if I go in, I'm aware that some people had the previous experience and now they might be projecting it on me. I'm just aware of it, and then I work from there. But I prefer wearing a tie, and every once in a while I wear a collar also. Yeah.
And my second quick question is, do you know, are physicians at your hospital using this FICA? I love this as a part of your history.
Yeah, it's built in the, we use Epic for charting, so it's built in the system. It's basically the questions, very, very basic 4 questions, and the nurses, when we do nursing orientation, we train them.
Well, the nurses do, but do you know, do the doctors?
Not at all, not
I don't
in my
know.
place.
I don't really think so. I think it depends on their training and maybe
Yeah.
their time, and I'm not really sure.
There's a lot of research, like if you look again on PubMed or any of that on FICA, there's a lot of research and it actually suggests what I said earlier, that when the doctor does it, it supports patient satisfaction. So I encourage.
And your patient satisfaction scores go up.
Uh,
HCAPS.
Right.
Yeah, right.
One, yes.
My question is, this wonderful, very mature model of pastoral care. And I was wondering, what can we take as a church from this? What can we learn and help to put it into the ecclesial context to minister to our own flock? And what would be some differences that may come about in that context?
Wonderful, wonderful question. There's so many things that. Well, first and foremost, this idea of spiritual care, generalist and specialist. If God forbid something happened to my eye, I can go to my primary physician, and he knows a little bit about eyes, but he's likely to recommend me to an ophthalmologist, right? It's the same way. The parish offers pastoral support, and the pastoral counseling is invaluable, and the parish itself is of support to a patient. Also note that when the patient is going to the hospital, it takes a little specialty to be able to sit with somebody in that, we call it appropriately, acute spiritual distress. So I would say that it takes, you see, I argue for all this training, and you heard people again from the war zones. That is not enough. Again, I'm a generalist maybe as a priest, but it takes a specialist as a chaplain to be in those acute situations and to sit with that acute distress and not go into that fixing mode and that. So maybe that's one of the distinction. Other than that, you said
also,
that
on a
earlier.
different tack. I think it's nice for anyone to be able to think about how to provide healthier, balanced, hopeful, meaningful spiritual care to anyone, and to kind of have the tools, just basic counseling tools, to talk to each other and care for each other, and to know that someone next to you in church is going through something painful, and how to kind of even just to be present with them and to support them and not make them feel worse, at least. I think, just sort of in terms of chaplaincy, we have more Orthodox chaplains. I think certain parishes, the priest is supportive and, pulls, when I was in California, my priest would say, oh, this family, the husband's about to have open heart surgery. Can you go, talk with this family?
Mm-hmm.
Or can you go sit with this person? I know her, her husband just died. So in some ways it's nice. I think it builds up the body of the church to have more people who are trained in this type of spiritual care. And I think it would be great if we had chaplains in parishes working with priests, working together. The priests and deacons have so much work to do. There's enough suffering in the world. There's lots of work to be done. Yeah. And so I think the more we really can encourage this within our tradition, our Orthodox, we didn't tell lots of inspiring, we have so many inspiring, amazing stories of working with patients and seeing God work with them and care for them and heal them. We have some, yes. Well, yeah.
You can listen to our podcast.
I can tell a billion.
Because each episode
has
one story and then the conceptual understanding of it. So we try to build on, and the patient said, and I said, and then we say, okay, and today we want to talk about this. So
we have such richness. I can think of many times when you're with a family and they're, many times being with patients who are actively dying, which is they're very close to dying, and the family member is saying, don't go, and they have all these fears and anxieties, and then maybe providing support to the spouse or family member, talking about peace and comfort, and then over time maybe encouraging the family member to say, it's okay to go, I love you, I'm gonna be okay. and I love you, and God is with you, and then in 10 seconds the patient dies. All the time. So that's really, that's an
Yes.
example.
Okay,
So
thank you
thank
again
you.
for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you for your participation.